2 years living under the same roof, yet he had never once touched her. Not a single embrace, not a single kiss, only silent dinners in a cold and lonely mansion. She wondered if she was truly his wife or only a name written on a contract. But tonight, everything would change. Damien Cross, a man of ice and iron, a billionaire untouched by warmth. 24 months had passed, and he and Amara Ellison still lived as strangers. Each night they sat at the long dining table, the white cloth spread neatly, the golden light falling over them. He ate in silence. She answered with silence. Between them stretched a distance no one seemed able to cross. Amara often dreamed of just one moment when he would turn, look at her, and see her as a woman, someone to be held, someone to be wanted. But that moment never came. Tonight, as the wind pressed against the glass windows and the heavy sky promised a storm, her heart whispered the question again. Could this silence really last forever? If you have ever felt the loneliness Amara carried, stay with us, because the story ahead may bring tears to your eyes and perhaps awaken a new faith in love. Damien Cross was 35 years old, a man whose name carried weight in every boardroom from Silicon Valley to Wall Street. He had built an empire out of code and vision, a technology company that changed the way the world lived. The press called him a genius. They painted him as untouchable, a man of brilliance and steel. But behind the headlines and polished photographs, Damien lived inside a fortress of silence. He had never dated, never kissed, never allowed himself the risk of attachment. Women admired him from a distance, but he remained cold, polite, and unreachable. For him, emotions were a liability. Intimacy was a weakness. Every day was measured in schedules, quarterly reports, and billion-dollar deals. Nights were no different. His penthouse in New York and his mansion in the Hamptons echoed with the same emptiness. He had everything money could buy, but nothing that could soften the loneliness pressing against his chest. To the world, Damien was power wrapped in elegance. To himself, he was a man terrified of being known. Amara Ellison was the daughter of a family steeped in politics and education. Her mother had been a professor at Howard University. Her father, a respected senator, moved in circles of quiet influence. Amara grew up polished, graceful, with expectations placed on her shoulders heavier than her own dreams. She was intelligent, refined, and beautiful, but she was taught early that marriage was not about love. It was about alliances, stability, appearances. Her heart was never asked what it wanted. When the Cross family and the Ellisons began to speak of a merger, not of companies but of legacies, Amara became the center of the conversation. Damien needed protection for his empire. The Ellisons sought a bond with the most powerful name in technology. Their first meeting was brief, conducted in a room filled with crystal glasses and polite silence. Damien studied her with unreadable eyes. Amara, equally guarded, returned the look without expectation. There were no sparks, no warmth, no hint of romance, only a recognition. Two people chosen to play roles neither had asked for. The wedding was private, efficient, and painfully hollow. No vows whispered in devotion. No tender kiss to seal a promise. Only signatures, photographs, and the applause of families who called it visionary. Amara wore silk that shimmered like frost, her smile practiced for the cameras. Damien stood beside her, composed, detached, every movement precise. To outsiders, it was elegance. To them, it was survival. After the ceremony, they moved into the Cross estate in the Hamptons. The mansion stretched wide, its wings designed like separate worlds. Damien took the west wing, Amara the east. The house was so vast that days could pass without a single encounter. Meals were taken in silence. Occasional appearances at charity events or corporate galas painted the image of a powerful couple. Yet, behind closed doors, they lived like shadows passing through the same corridors, never colliding, never touching. It was not cruelty, but emptiness. A marriage built on terms, not tenderness. A life agreed upon but never shared. Days blurred into months, and months into 2 long years. The mansion became a theater of silence. Damien buried himself in work. His hours stretched into nights spent in his private study, surrounded by glowing screens and reports. The empire consumed him, leaving no room for warmth. Amara created her own routines. She read for hours in the East Wing's library. She poured her energy into philanthropy, launching initiatives for education and community programs. She smiled for cameras, hosted dinners, played her part as the elegant Mrs. Cross. Yet, when the guests left and the lights dimmed, she returned to an empty bed. They crossed paths only in passing, a nod in the hallway, a brief exchange at the dinner table, sometimes not even that. At first, Amara wondered if it was her fault. Was she not beautiful enough? Not interesting enough? But in time, she understood. Damien's silence was not rejection. It was retreat. He lived behind glass walls too thick for anyone to break, and so they became strangers bound by duty, living in parallel worlds under the same roof. The rain came heavy against the tall windows, streaks of water racing down the glass like restless thoughts. It was nearing midnight when the front door opened with a sharp click. Amara lifted her head from the piano where she had been sitting, restless, unable to sleep. Damien stepped inside, his black suit damp, his dark hair slicked back by the storm. He looked less like the polished billionaire and more like a man who had finally allowed the night to touch him. For the first time, he seemed human. Their eyes met across the wide music room. For 2 years they had passed each other without words, without even glances that lingered. But now he looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. "Amara," he said. Her name carried weight, a tremor in his voice that unsettled the silence. She froze. It was the first time he had ever spoken her name like that. "You're home early," she answered quietly, her fingers tightening around the edge of the piano. He nodded once, still standing in the doorway, water dripping from his sleeve. For a moment, nothing else existed but the charged space between them. Damien stepped closer. His shoes pressed softly against the polished floor, each step steady yet uncertain. Amara's breath caught as the distance between them dissolved. She had imagined this moment in restless dreams, yet reality felt heavier, sharper. "You're awake," he murmured. His voice was low, almost unsure. "I couldn't sleep," she replied, her tone careful, searching his face. He stood only a few feet away now. For the first time she noticed his hands trembling. Damien Cross, the man known for his control, for his unshakable calm, looked unguarded. He reached out slowly, as if testing a boundary. His fingers brushed against her wrist. The touch was barely there, lighter than breath, but it sent a shock through her veins. Amara's eyes widened, but she didn't move away. His touch lingered, hesitant, reverent. His hand slid up her arm, pausing near her shoulder. She felt the storm outside echo inside her chest. He did not retreat, neither did she. The silence stretched, filled with something they both had been running from, and in that fragile moment, the wall between them cracked. The room held its breath. Damien's hand rose to her face, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. Amara's lips parted in surprise, her pulse racing. He leaned closer, his breath warm with the faint scent of rain. At first, his lips touched hers with hesitation, a question more than a claim. But when she answered, when her mouth opened to him, the kiss deepened. Years of silence shattered in that instant. The restraint that had defined them dissolved. Damien pulled her closer, his other hand finding the curve of her back. Amara's arms rose, circling his neck, holding on as if afraid the moment might vanish. The kiss grew urgent, not careless, but desperate. It was as though gravity had waited for this pull, and now nothing could resist. When he finally broke away, their foreheads touched. His chest rose and fell, unsteady. She could see it in his eyes, the fear, the wonder, the hunger. "Damien," she whispered, her voice trembling. He said nothing. Instead, he kissed her again, harder this time, sealing the choice neither of them had dared to make until now. They moved together down the long corridor, guided less by decision than by instinct. The house, usually cold and hollow, felt alive, pulsing with their steps. Damien lifted her with ease, carrying her toward the bedroom she had thought would always be hers alone. Clothes slipped away in silence. There were no words, only hands discovering skin, lips tracing forgotten places, breaths breaking against the storm outside. Damien's touch was reverent, as if he feared she might vanish. Mara felt the trembling in his body, the mix of desire and fear. It was not lust alone. It was surrender. A man who had never let anyone close was allowing himself to fall, and a woman who had been invisible for too long was finally seen. When it was over, they lay tangled in sheets, their bodies still, their breathing heavy. Amara turned toward him, searching his face. He stared at the ceiling, jaw tight, as though already retreating into silence. She wanted to ask what it meant. She wanted him to say something, anything. But the words never came. Instead, the night settled around them, unforgettable and terrifying all at once. The sun rose through pale curtains, spilling light across the bed. Amara stirred, her body still aching with the memory of his touch. For the first time in 2 years, she felt warmth beside her. She turned, hopeful. Damien was already sitting on the edge of the bed, dressed in yesterday's trousers and shirt. His back was rigid, his hand pressed to his knee. His silence was heavy. "Damien," she whispered, wrapping the sheet around her chest. He flinched almost imperceptibly. Then he spoke, his voice clipped. "I have to go." "To work?" she asked, though she knew the answer. He nodded once. Then, after a pause, he added the words that cut sharper than any silence. "What happened last night was a mistake." Her lips parted, her chest tightening. "A mistake?" she echoed softly. He turned at last to face her. His expression was calm, but his eyes betrayed him, conflicted, almost pained. "It cannot happen again," he said. Amara stared at him, her heart breaking open. The night she thought had changed everything had been reduced to a lapse, a regret, and with those words, the fragile hope she carried began to crumble. The hours after that morning stretched into days, then weeks. Damien buried himself in work, drowning in meetings, numbers, and strategies. The company became his shield, a fortress stronger than stone walls. He returned late, left early, and spoke little when at home. Amara withdrew into herself. She still moved with grace, still smiled when duty demanded, but inside she carried a wound that refused to close. She replayed his words over and over, a mistake. Each repetition cut deeper. The mansion grew colder. Their encounters shrank to polite nods in corridors, brief exchanges over untouched dinners. When guests visited, they played their roles flawlessly. No one would guess the silence pressing between them. At night, Amara lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Damien was only rooms away, yet he might as well have been oceans apart. She thought of that night often, the way he had trembled, the way his eyes had softened. She had felt something real, something alive. Now, it was as if it had never happened. The silence returned, heavier than before, because this time it carried the memory of what they had lost. Neither of them could forget. Damien told himself it was nothing, a lapse in judgment, a break in discipline. Yet her face lingered in his mind. The warmth of her skin haunted his hands. The sound of her whisper echoed in his chest. He worked harder, stayed later, tried to erase her from his thoughts, but the memory refused to leave. Amara, too, carried the night with her. The house was full of reminders. The staircase where his hand had brushed hers, the hallway where his eyes had lingered, the doorway to her bedroom, now tainted with the scent of him. Every corner of the estate seemed charged, alive with shadows of what they had shared. She tried to bury herself in reading, in charity work, in the routines that once kept her safe, but her heart betrayed her. Each time she heard his footsteps in the west wing, her pulse quickened. Each time she saw him at the dinner table, her mind replayed the feel of his lips. They both pretended, but the truth lived quietly between them. The silence was no longer empty. It was thick, vibrating with everything they refused to acknowledge. The second anniversary of their marriage arrived with little notice. No celebration, no mention. Only an invitation on Amara's dressing table, formal and impersonal. A gala hosted by Cross Technologies in New York City. She dressed in a navy gown that flowed like liquid night, her hair pinned with precise elegance. When she entered the foyer, Damien was waiting in a black tuxedo. His eyes flickered over her form, a pause that was too brief, yet unmistakable. "You look elegant," he said. His tone was measured, but the words hung between them. "Thank you," she replied softly. The ride to the gala was quiet, the space between them filled with unspoken tension. At the venue, chandeliers glittered overhead, music floated through the air, and cameras flashed as they entered together. To the world, they appeared flawless, the perfect couple. But Damien could not look away from her. The way she moved through the crowd, the way people leaned in to hear her, the way she laughed, light and rare, ignited something inside him. For the first time, he did not see her as the woman he had married by duty. He saw her as someone he could lose. Among the polished guests, one figure stood out. Julian St. James, a hedge fund manager known for his charm, approached Amara with a smile too smooth to be harmless. He was mid-30s, handsome, and practiced in the art of conversation. Amara listened politely, nodding as he spoke of markets and travel, her own responses careful, refined. But when Julian touched her arm lightly, his hand lingering just a moment too long, Damien felt his chest tighten. He stood across the room, a glass of champagne in hand. His jaw flexed, his knuckles whitening around the stem of the glass. He had no right, no claim, and yet jealousy burned through him like fire. Julian leaned closer to Amara, whispering something that made her lips curve in a small smile. That smile, Damien's restraint cracked. His pulse hammered, his vision narrowed until all he could see was her, standing there, allowing another man's presence so close. The music swelled, the crowd moved, but for Damien, the gala had dissolved into a single, unbearable scene. Amara's quiet laugh at someone else's words. He set the glass down too hard, the sound sharp. He was already moving toward them, unable to stop himself. Damien appeared at Amara's side with a presence that silenced conversation. Julian stepped back, surprised, but Damien's eyes never left Amara. "We should go," he said, his voice low, almost commanding. Amara's brows lifted. "It's only 10 o'clock. "I've had enough of the spotlight," Damien replied, though his tone carried something darker. His gaze flicked once at Julian, sharp and unyielding. Julian chuckled lightly, as if unfazed. "Don't worry, Cross. I'll keep her company." Damien's jaw tightened. "That won't be necessary." Amara looked between them, sensing the storm beneath Damien's calm surface. She gave Julian a polite smile. "Of course. We should leave." The ride home was thick with silence. Damien stared out the window, his profile hard against the city lights. Amara sat with her hands folded in her lap, her heartbeat unsteady. She could feel the tension rolling off him, though he said nothing. When they reached the estate, she stepped out first, her heels clicking against the marble. She walked ahead, but at the base of the staircase, she stopped and turned. "You don't get to do that," she said evenly, her voice calm but sharp. The silence between them cracked open, ready to explode. Amara stood at the base of the staircase, her voice sharp but steady. "You don't have the right to be jealous when you've already called me a mistake." Damien stopped in his tracks. His eyes darkened, his breath caught, but he didn't turn away. "You think I don't know that?" he said, his tone rough, breaking through the calm he usually wore like armor. "I tried to push you away. I told myself it meant nothing. But every time I see you, every time another man stands too close, He cut himself off, his jaw tightening. Amara lifted her chin. "You don't get to play both sides. You can't wound me with silence and then claim me with jealousy." His hand flexed at his side, restless, searching for words. Finally, he met her gaze, his voice lower now, unsteady. "I don't want to care. I don't want to feel this way." "Then stop," she challenged. He stepped closer, his voice breaking. I can't stop." The silence that followed was thick, charged, neither of them willing to retreat. Damien's composure cracked. He pressed a hand against the banister, as if the weight of his own admission was too much to hold. "I'm obsessed with you, Amara," he said finally, his voice raw. "Like a man addicted to something he knows will destroy him. I walk past your door, and it feels like fire under my skin. I hear your voice in my head when I try to sleep. I look at you, and everything I built, everything I swore I'd control, falls apart." Amara stared at him, her lips parting. She had never seen him like this. The man who lived behind glass walls was standing bare before her, trembling with the truth he could no longer bury. "You think I wanted this?" he continued, his eyes flashing with desperation. "I never wanted anyone close. It was easier to be cold, easier to be untouchable. But you—" his voice faltered. "You ruined me, just by existing in the same room." Amara's breath shook. In that moment she saw not the billionaire, not the man of power, but someone stripped of his defenses. For the first time his walls were not made of glass. They were falling. The air between them throbbed with unspoken desire. Neither moved at first, as if the wrong step would shatter the fragile honesty hanging in the space. Then Amara reached out, her hand brushing his sleeve. The small touch was enough. Damien caught her hand, holding it as though it were the only thing keeping him alive. No words followed. None were needed. Slowly, deliberately, he guided her up the staircase. This time, there was no hesitation, no retreat. It was not a lapse. It was a choice. In the privacy of her room, they came together again. Not in fear, not in denial, but in acceptance. Every kiss was an answer, every touch a confession. The urgency of the first night was gone. What replaced it was deeper, steadier, threaded with something fragile and real. When at last they lay in silence, the storm inside him quieted. Damien rested his forehead against hers, his hand still entwined with hers beneath the sheets. For the first time, he allowed himself to stay. Amara closed her eyes, a tear slipping free. She knew nothing was fixed yet, but tonight he had chosen her, and she had chosen him. The days that followed unfolded differently. Small shifts at first, almost unnoticeable, yet undeniable. Damien no longer disappeared behind closed doors the moment he returned home. Instead, he lingered in the kitchen while Amara poured her tea. He paused by the French doors, watching her tend the rosemary plants she had insisted on growing herself. At breakfast, he sat across from her, a cup of coffee cooling in his hands. They spoke in fragments, conversations about books, weather, or the chaos of boardrooms. It was not much, but it was more than silence. Amara began to learn his quiet habits. He hated silk sheets, preferred the coarse comfort of cotton. He read crime novels late into the night, though he never admitted it aloud. He never ate blueberries because of one childhood accident. Damien, in turn, discovered her love for old poetry, her habit of humming off-key when cooking, her collection of fountain pens that reminded her of her grandfather. Their routines became a rhythm, soft and steady. It was not romance in grand gestures. It was in the way he lingered, the way she stayed. For the first time, the mansion no longer felt like a prison. It felt almost like home. One gray afternoon, Amara caught a chill. It was nothing serious, only a cough and a low fever. She would have managed it alone, as she always had. But Damien found her curled on the library sofa, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, a novel slipping from her fingers. Something inside him shifted. He canceled his meetings without hesitation. He brewed tea, fumbling as he searched online for how long to steep the leaves. He found a thermometer, crouching beside her until she used it. His hands hovered near her, restless with concern. "You're fussing," Amara whispered, her voice weak but touched with surprise. Damien blinked, startled. "Am I?" She smiled faintly. "A little." He looked at her for a long moment, then said softly, "I don't know how not to fuss when you look like this." That evening, she woke to find a tray by her side. Soup, still warm, a napkin folded neatly, a handwritten note in his distinct script. "You don't have to do everything alone. Not anymore." Tears blurred her vision as she pressed the note to her chest. For the first time, Damien's care was not hidden. It was open, tender, undeniable. When Amara woke this next morning, the tray was still beside her. The soup had cooled, but the folded napkin remained, neat and precise. On top of it lay a small piece of paper in Damien's handwriting. "You don't have to do everything alone. Not anymore." Her breath caught. She pressed the note to her lips, then to her chest. It was simple, almost plain, but the words struck harder than any grand gesture. For 2 years, she had carried her burdens silently. She had cooked, hosted, smiled, and endured, never asking for help. She had believed no one would ever stand beside her. And now, with a few words, Damien had broken that belief. Tears spilled before she could stop them. She curled around the note, shaking with quiet sobs. It was not pity she felt, but release. Someone finally saw her. Someone finally cared enough to write it down. When she stepped out of the library later, Damien was already gone for the day. But the paper remained in her hand, folded tightly, like a promise she refused to let go. For the first time in years, Amara no longer felt invisible. The week after her illness, the weather cleared. Autumn leaves carpeted the garden paths outside the estate. One afternoon, Damien surprised her by standing at the door with his coat in hand. "Shall we walk?" he asked simply. She hesitated, then nodded. They stepped into the crisp air, their breaths visible in the cool light. For the first time since their marriage, they walked side by side. No cameras, no audience, no performance. Just two people finding rhythm in each other's steps. The silence between them was different now. Not empty, but gentle. She spoke first, mentioning the roses she hoped to replant in spring. He listened, truly listened, asking small questions. In return, he shared fragments, about the pressure of investors, about his preference for coffee over tea, about little details no one else knew. Their arms brushed once. Neither pulled away. It was not a date, not a declaration, but it was something. The normalcy of it felt more intimate than any gala or staged appearance. As they turned back toward the house, Amara realized she was smiling without effort. And when Damien opened the door for her, his hand lingered at the small of her back, steady and warm. The following evening, they found themselves in the library. A fire crackled faintly, casting soft shadows. Damien stood near the shelves, his gaze lost on the rows of books. Amara closed the journal she had been writing in and looked at him. "You're quieter than usual," she said. He exhaled slowly. "I used to think being cold was strength." His voice was low, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "Distance kept me safe. No one could hurt me if no one got close." She tilted her head, watching him carefully. "But I see now," he continued, his eyes lifting to hers. "It wasn't strength. It was loneliness. Dressed up in control. I've spent my whole life mistaking isolation for power." Amara's throat tightened. She had waited for this moment, for him to name the silence for what it was. "You don't have to keep carrying it," she said softly. His jaw worked, his expression torn. "I don't know how to stop." She crossed the room, stopping close enough for him to feel her presence. "You already have," she whispered. The admission hung between them, fragile but true. For the first time, Damien didn't turn away. A few days later, they walked again, this time under the canopy of maples at the edge of the estate. The branches swayed above them, golden leaves drifting down in slow spirals. Amara stopped suddenly, turning to face him. Her heart pounded, but her voice was steady. "I want to try," she said. "Not just the house, not just the name. I want love, Damien. I want us." He froze, her words sinking deep. His usual mask of control was gone, replaced by something raw. Slowly, he lifted his hand to her face, cupping her cheek. "I want that too," he said, the admission breaking from him like a confession. "More than I ever thought I could." The wind rustled, carrying the moment forward. Damien leaned down, and she rose slightly to meet him. Their lips touched softly at first, then deepened, slow and reverent. It was not desperation this time, but renewal. They stood beneath the trees, held together by a kiss that promised something greater than duty. When they finally pulled back, Amara rested her forehead against his. Her whisper trembled. "So, we begin?" His answer was a simple nod, but his eyes carried the weight of a vow. Winter crept closer, bringing with it a quiet Damien could no longer ignore. One evening, he approached Amara in the study. "Come with me this weekend," he said. "There's a place I want you to see." They drove for hours through bare trees and winding roads until they reached a secluded lake in Vermont. The house was modest compared to the estate, built of wood and stone, smoke already rising from its chimney. Amara walked slowly through the rooms, taking in the old photographs, the worn furniture, the scent of cedar. Damien lingered in the doorway, his eyes fixed on a framed picture of himself as a boy beside a woman with warm eyes. "Your mother?" Amara asked gently. He nodded, his throat tight. "She used to bring me here when I couldn't sleep. She said the water listened better than people did." His voice faltered. "She died when I was 19. Amara slipped her hand into his. For a moment he didn't look at her, but his grip tightened as though holding on for strength. For the first time, Damien allowed his walls to fall. A tear slipped down his face, unguarded, and he did not turn away. That night, the lake was still, the stars sharp against the black sky. Damien and Amara stood wrapped in blankets, their breaths curling into the cold. Silence stretched between them, not empty, but waiting. Damien's eyes lifted to the heavens, then fell back to hers. "I've never said this to anyone," he began, his voice low, trembling with truth. "But I love you, Amara." Her chest tightened, her lips parted, but no words came. He stepped closer, his gloved hand brushing her cheek. "I tried not to. I told myself it would be safer, easier to keep you out. But you made it impossible. I love the way you hum when you think, the way you look at people when you're truly listening. I love how you still believe in goodness even after everything." Tears spilled down Amara's face. Her hand pressed to his chest, feeling the rush of his heart. "I love you too," she whispered, her voice breaking. Damien pulled her into his arms, holding her as if afraid she might disappear. Beneath the stars, two strangers who had once lived in silence finally confessed what neither could deny any longer. They returned to the estate changed. The house, once cold and cavernous, seemed softer now. The walls still stood tall, but the silence no longer echoed with emptiness. It held warmth instead. Damien no longer retreated to the west wing alone. He lingered in shared spaces, working at the dining table while Amara read nearby. They ate together not out of duty but choice, conversations flowing with ease. Amara filled the house with touches of life, wildflowers on the windowsill, a lemon tree in the kitchen, colors where once there had only been gray. Damien surprised her by loving it all. He never said so directly, but the way he lingered in the rooms she decorated spoke for him. At night, they shared the same bed without hesitation. Sometimes they spoke until dawn about childhood memories and hidden fears. Sometimes they said nothing, only lay wrapped in each other's arms, breathing in rhythm. The mansion was no longer a place of exile. It had become their home, and for Damien, the greatest change was simple. He no longer felt alone. Amara was there, constant, steady, and real. Together, they were learning how to live not in silence, but in love. One morning, Amara stood in the bathroom staring at the small test in her hand. 2 faint lines appeared, clear and undeniable. Her breath caught, her heart racing. For a moment she felt stunned, frozen between fear and awe. Then slowly, she smiled. When she found Damien in the bedroom, he was buttoning his shirt for the day. Without a word, she placed the test in his palm and closed his fingers around it. He looked down, confusion flickering across his face. Then, realization struck. His eyes widened, his lips parting as he stared at her. "We're going to be parents," Amara said softly, her voice trembling with joy. Damien's throat closed. He set the test aside and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could feel his heart break open. Tears slipped down his cheeks, silent and unstoppable. "I didn't think I could have this," he whispered against her hair. "A family, a life, not like this." "You didn't just get it," she whispered back. "You built it, with me." He kissed her then, fierce and grateful, the weight of years of loneliness dissolving. For the first time, he believed in miracles. Years passed, and the estate was no longer quiet. Laughter echoed through the halls. A little girl with bright eyes raced through the gardens, chasing butterflies among the lemon trees Amara had planted long ago. Amara painted in the sunroom, her daughter sometimes beside her with a brush of her own. Damien often sat nearby with a book, one hand reaching out absent-mindedly to touch Amara's when their arms brushed. The family moved through their days in gentle rhythm. Shared breakfasts, walks through the gardens, evenings by the fire where their daughter fell asleep in Amara's lap while Damien read aloud. Every corner of the house, once marked by silence, now carried the sound of life. Damien often found himself watching, overwhelmed by quiet gratitude. He had once thought himself unfit for love, destined only for solitude. Now he had a wife he adored, a child who called him father, and a home filled with light. One afternoon, as the sun fell over the garden, Damien caught Amara's gaze. She smiled, eyes warm with the same love that had once terrified him. He smiled back, his heart whispering the only truth that mattered. They had finally become a family. Their story had begun as a transaction. A marriage signed in ink, bound by money, by family, by reputation. For 2 years, they lived like strangers under one roof, each imprisoned by silence. But silence could not last forever. One night of rain, one fragile touch, began to break the walls. What followed was not easy. There was denial, pain, fear. Yet slowly, through jealousy, through confession, through tender care, love took root. Damien and Amara had been given wealth and influence, but those things had never filled the emptiness. What saved them was not money, not legacy, but love, the kind that demands vulnerability, the kind that gives life meaning. They began as 2 souls bound by duty. They became partners bound by choice, and in time, they built something no contract could create, a family, a home, a love that lasted. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to believe in second chances. And don't forget to subscribe so you can join us for more journeys like this, stories of love, of healing, of finding life where once there was only silence. Sometimes the smallest step can change everything.